20 years ago, I stumbled across something I still struggle to explain. A newborn Bigfoot hidden away in a mountain cave in the Rockies. I took care of it for years, until the day it was strong enough to survive on its own. I've never told anyone this story before, and there's a reason for that. But this is how it began. It was the afternoon of September 22nd, 2004. I was deep in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, hiking a backcountry trail I knew almost by heart. I'd been coming out here for years, long enough that I didn't even need trail markers anymore. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a sharp blue with no clouds in sight, and the temperature hovered somewhere in the mid-50s. Perfect hiking weather. I'd started before sunrise and spent most of the day moving through thick stands of spruce and fir. The kind of forest that swallows sound and stretches endlessly in every direction. No cabins, no power lines, no roads, just mountains layered on mountains. That isolation was why I loved the place. You could disappear out there if you wanted to. By mid-afternoon, I was roughly 7 miles from where I'd parked my truck, planning to turn south and make a wide loop back before dark. That's when I heard it. The sound came from uphill, echoing faintly through the trees. I stopped walking instantly. At first I thought it might be some kind of bird, maybe a raven or an injured hawk. But the longer I stood there listening, the less that explanation fit. The noise wavered, breaking off and starting again, uneven and strained. It wasn't a bear cub. I'd encountered those before, and their cries are rough and breathy, more like snorts and growls. It wasn't a mountain lion either, whose young have a sharp, piercing scream that cuts straight through you. This was different. It made my skin prickle. It sounded disturbingly close to a human infant, except deeper, fuller somehow, like the sound had more weight behind it. There was panic in it, fear, weakness. Each cry seemed to bounce off the slope and sink into my chest. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was some animal I just hadn't heard before, that getting curious off-trail was how people got hurt or worse. I took a few steps away, but the crying followed me, fading and returning, growing thinner the farther I went. That's when the guilt set in. I don't have children, never planned to, but something about that sound hit a nerve I didn't know existed. After about 10 minutes of fighting it, I gave in. I turned around and started climbing straight up the slope toward where the noise was coming from. The ground turned nasty fast. Loose stones slid under my boots. Fallen trees blocked my path, and thick brush clawed at my arms and pack. I had to haul myself upward, using saplings and exposed roots, my boots slipping every few steps. Even with the cool mountain air, I was sweating hard, my breathing heavy as the elevation started to catch up with me. By then, I was probably close to 9,000 feet. My thighs burned, my lungs felt tight, and twice I nearly rolled an ankle on roots hidden under pine needles. Just when I was starting to think turning back might be the smart move, I spotted something ahead. It was a dark opening in the rock face, barely visible behind a massive fallen tree and a mess of tangled shrubs. If not for the sound coming from inside, I would have passed it dozens of times without ever noticing. The log looked ancient, half rotted and blanketed in moss, like it had been there longer than I'd been alive. The opening itself was small, maybe 3 feet wide at most. I had to snap branches and shove brush aside just to get close enough to look in. The crying was unmistakably coming from within now, weaker than before, broken and irregular, like whatever was making it was running out of strength. I hesitated. Entering an unfamiliar cave alone is about as reckless as it gets in the wilderness. It could have been a den. It could have collapsed. Something bigger could have been waiting inside. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to walk away, but the sound was fading, and I had this overwhelming certainty that if I didn't go in right then, I'd be leaving something to die. I pulled out my flashlight, dropped to my knees, and called out as I crawled forward, hoping to warn off any animal inside. The passage was tight and suffocating, the stone ceiling so low it brushed my back. The smell hit me almost immediately, wet soil mixed with a strong, musky odor I couldn't place. My heart hammered as I edged ahead, fully prepared to scramble backward if things went bad. After about 6 feet, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, maybe 8 feet across and low enough that I had to crouch. My flashlight beam swept the space, revealing jagged stone walls, dried leaves, and scattered droppings on the floor. And then I saw it. Curled up against the far wall was something no bigger than a toddler, maybe 2 feet tall, covered head to toe in thick, dark auburn fur clumped with dirt. For a split second, my mind tried to label it a bear cub, desperate for logic to grab onto. But the shape was wrong. The proportions didn't match anything I knew. Its arms were far too long for its body, hanging awkwardly at its sides, even as it curled in on itself. And its face, God, that face, was disturbingly close to human. Not identical, not quite right, but similar enough to make my stomach twist. The eyes were huge, glossy and black, and when my flashlight caught them, they reflected the beam with a wet, desperate look that felt like it was locking on to me. Its skull rose upward in a gentle slope, almost pointed, nothing like any ape or monkey I'd ever seen in a zoo or on TV. When it noticed me fully, it lifted one of those long arms and reached out. Its hands were small, but unmistakable. 5 fingers, perfectly shaped, the tiny knuckles flexing as it grasped at the air between us. That simple, painfully human gesture hit me harder than anything else I'd seen. I panicked. I scrambled backward so fast I nearly slammed my head into the cave ceiling, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. My hands were shaking as I clawed my way out of the tunnel and back into daylight, sucking in cold air like I'd just surfaced from underwater. What I had just seen wasn't possible. There was no mental box for it. I'd been roaming these mountains for over a decade and a half. I knew the wildlife. I'd crossed paths with moose, black bears, cougars, even wolves once. None of that prepared me for what was inside that cave. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to hike straight back to my truck, drive home, and bury the memory under 1,000 rational explanations. Altitude sickness, exhaustion, dehydration, my brain misfiring under stress. But I couldn't shake the image of those hands reaching toward me. I backed away downslope until I was a good 200 yards from the cave and tucked myself behind a cluster of house-sized boulders that gave me a clear line of sight to the entrance. From there, I could watch without being obvious. If something big came back, I didn't want to be standing in the open. I settled in as best I could on the cold ground, pulling my jacket tighter around myself. I told myself the mother would return. Whatever that thing was, it had to have parents. That was the only explanation that made any sense. They'd gone out to forage or hunt and would come back soon. That was normal. That was logical. The sun dipped lower, washing the slope in warm amber light that made everything look calm, almost serene. It was hard to reconcile that peaceful scene with what I knew was hiding just beyond that cave mouth. I scanned the tree line constantly, watching for branches shifting or shadows moving between trunks. Birds called overhead. Somewhere nearby, a chipmunk scolded something I couldn't see. The forest carried on like it always did, completely indifferent to the impossible situation unfolding in its midst. Time dragged. The golden light faded into pink, then violet, then finally into the deep blue of dusk. The temperature dropped fast, the way it always does at elevation once the sun disappears. By full dark, it had sunk into the low 30s, maybe colder. My breath puffed out in small clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. From the cave, the cries continued, but weaker now, less frequent. Sometimes minutes passed between them. In the darkness, the sound seemed thinner, more hollow, like it was echoing off emptiness. I waited. Nothing came. No heavy footsteps. No massive shape pushing through brush. No movement except shadows, shifting as the moon climbed higher. I checked my watch again and again. 7:15, 8:30, 9:45. The cold seeped through my boots and into my bones. My fingers went numb even inside my gloves. I shifted my weight and quietly stamped my feet from time to time, careful not to make enough noise to announce myself. I didn't want to scare off anything that might still be coming. By midnight, the sounds from the cave had dwindled to faint whimpers, barely more than breathy little noises that cut straight through me. The cold had deepened, and my breath showed thick and white in the moonlight, hanging longer in the still air. I'd been crouched behind those rocks for 7 hours. In all that time, I hadn't seen a single large animal move through the trees. That's when it finally sank in. No one was coming back for it. Either the mother was dead or injured somewhere out there, unable to return, or, and this thought sat like a stone in my gut, it had been left behind on purpose. Maybe it was sick. Maybe it was weak. Maybe that's how these creatures survived, by abandoning the ones that couldn't keep up. Animal control wouldn't have been any different. Same outcome, and calling the police. That would have ended with someone shining a flashlight in my eyes and asking if I'd been drinking. What was I supposed to say? That I'd discovered a baby Bigfoot tucked away in a cave? Best case, they'd laugh it off. Worst case, they'd put me on a psychiatric hold. Even if, somehow, I convinced anyone to come back up there with me, it would have taken hours. By then, the cold would have done its job. I'd seen what exposure does to animals before. It isn't fast, and it sure isn't gentle. The idea of that tiny creature freezing to death alone in the dark made my stomach twist. A little after 1 in the morning, I stopped arguing with myself. I shrugged out of my pack, grabbed my jacket tighter around me, checked my water bottle, and crawled back into the cave, guiding myself forward with my flashlight. The air inside felt colder than before, heavier somehow. The infant was still curled up in the same corner, but it barely moved now. Its chest fluttered with quick, shallow breaths that sounded wrong, too fast, too thin. When my light hit it, those oversized eyes lifted toward me, and something like recognition passed over its face. It didn't try to flee. It didn't bare teeth or cry out. It just reached for me again. Its hands trembled as they stretched toward me, and it let out a faint, broken sound that sliced straight through every defense I had left. There was no fear in it, just need. Trust it had no reason to give. That was it. I was done pretending I could walk away. I took off my jacket and wrapped it gently around the small body. The second the fabric touched it, the infant latched on with startling force. Even weak and half-frozen, its grip was incredible. Those tiny fingers locked into the material like it was the only thing keeping it alive, because it probably was. It pressed itself against my chest, shivering so hard I could feel it through the layers. Its heart hammered fast and frantic beneath the jacket, a panicked rhythm that made my own chest ache. It felt impossibly light, fragile, like it might break if I moved the wrong way. I eased backward out of the cave, shielding the bundle with both arms, then turned and started the long descent toward my truck. I tucked it beneath my coat, holding it tight against my body heat. It probably weighed 15 pounds, maybe less, but navigating that trail in total darkness made every step dangerous. I kept one arm locked around the bundle and used my free hand to manage the flashlight and steady myself. The beam felt pitiful, just a narrow tunnel of light surrounded by endless black. Every snap of a branch or rustle in the brush sent adrenaline spiking through me. I kept expecting it. Some massive shape exploding out of the darkness, fury and muscle and teeth, punishing me for stealing its young. My imagination ran wild, playing out scene after scene where I never made it back. But nothing came. The forest stayed the same, quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds. An owl called somewhere far off. Something small darted through the undergrowth. Wind whispered through the trees. Against my chest, the infant made faint noises, soft, breathy sounds that grew less frequent as it burned through what little strength it had left. I talked to it the whole way down, murmuring reassurances in a low, steady voice. I didn't know if it understood a word, but I hoped the sound of another heartbeat might help. The trail felt twice as long in the dark. Familiar landmarks looked strange and distorted, shadows swallowing everything. At one point, my flashlight flickered and died outright, the batteries choosing the worst possible moment to give up. I nearly stepped straight off a drop before catching myself, my heart slamming into my throat as I fumbled for my backup light. By the time I finally saw the dull reflection of my truck's bumper in the beam, my legs were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. I reached it sometime around 3 a.m. I carefully settled the bundle into the passenger seat, still wrapped in my jacket, barely visible against the upholstery. I cranked the heater all the way up and just sat there for a moment, breathing, trying to slow my heart. Then I started driving. The questions came fast and relentless. What was I supposed to do now? How was I going to explain this to my wife? What did it eat? How fragile was it really? How long could I keep it alive? But beneath all of that noise was one clear truth. I couldn't let it die, and I couldn't hand it over to anyone who might cage it, experiment on it, or lock it away in some facility where it would never see the forest again. The drive home took nearly 2 hours along dark, winding mountain roads. Every few minutes, I glanced at the passenger seat, watching for movement, listening for sound. The infant stirred occasionally, letting out faint noises. Each time, I felt a rush of relief. It was still breathing. It was still holding on. A few times during that drive, its breathing became so faint, I was sure it had slipped away. Each time, my chest tightened until it suddenly pulled in a sharp breath and started again. The roads were deserted at that hour, just my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the dark. the occasional pair of glowing eyes flashing from the roadside before vanishing. My wife being gone that week felt unreal in its timing. She was visiting her sister out of state, and it felt less like coincidence and more like the universe buying me time to deal with the impossible before I had to explain it. I pulled into our garage and shut the door behind me before lifting the bundle out of the truck. We lived on about 5 acres outside a quiet mountain town, with state forest stretching out behind the house and the closest neighbor nearly half a mile away. I'd always liked the seclusion. That night, I depended on it. I carried the infant straight to the basement. Down there, I laid out old comforters and towels, rigging a crude nest and plugging in a heating pad set to its lowest setting. Under the harsh basement lights, I finally got a clear look at what I'd brought home. It was definitely some kind of primate, but nothing I'd ever seen cataloged. Its fur was thick and uneven, a deep rust brown with lighter coloring across its chest and around its face. It looked coarse, almost wiry, yet somehow I knew it would feel warm and soft if touched. Its face was the hardest part to process. A heavy brow cast shadows over its eyes. Its nose was broad and flattened, the nostrils wide, but the eyes themselves stopped me cold. They weren't dull or vacant like an animal's. They followed me deliberately, taking me in, reacting. There was awareness there, curiosity, something uncomfortably close to understanding. Its hands and feet were astonishing, fully formed, with opposable thumbs and sensitive-looking pads on its fingers. The fingers themselves were longer than a human baby's, thinner, more precise. When it wrapped its hand around my finger, the grip was careful but shockingly strong, hinting at the power hiding beneath that fragile body. I tried giving it water from a bottle, but it didn't seem to know what to do. It opened its mouth when the nipple touched its lips, but it didn't suck or swallow. Minutes passed, and panic started to creep in as I watched it grow more lethargic, its eyelids drooping. Desperation pushed me into improvising. I remembered reading that orphaned animals often responded to milk. I mashed up a banana, thinned it out with milk until it was almost liquid, and carefully touched the spoon to its mouth. Instant reaction. It started eating right away, messy, clumsy, smearing more across its face than actually getting down at first. But it was eating. It drained 3 small bowls before finally stopping, its belly round and full beneath the fur, its movements slowing as exhaustion overtook hunger. That first week nearly broke me. I called in sick to work, claiming some brutal flu, and barely left the basement. I slept in short stretches, if at all, setting alarms every 2 hours to check on it, touching its chest to feel it rise, making sure it was still warm, still breathing. It slept most of those first days, recovering, its small body finally able to rest. I found myself staring at it constantly, watching the steady rhythm of its breathing like my life depended on it. When it was awake, though, it showed an intelligence that left me speechless. It learned to climb before it could walk properly, hauling itself up the basement stairs and latching onto exposed beams and pipes with terrifying ease. Its grip strength was unreal. I once watched it hang from a metal pipe for nearly 20 minutes without slipping, its little body swaying gently as it studied the room from above. It bonded to me fast. If I left the basement, it cried, sharp, distressed sounds that stopped the second I returned. When I moved around the room, its eyes followed me constantly. It made soft, breathy noises Whenever I looked back at it, almost conversational. Once it gained strength, it followed me everywhere. A small blur of fur scrambling after my heels, climbing up my legs when I stopped moving. If I went upstairs, it climbed after me. If I sat down, it clambered into my lap and settled there like it belonged. The attachment was immediate and complete. I wasn't just a caretaker. I was its anchor, its safety, its entire world. I began experimenting with food, testing different options carefully. I learned quickly that it favored fruits, berries, and roots above all else, though it wasn't especially picky. If I offered it something, it would at least try it. By the end of that week, it was stronger, and so was the bond between us. It went wild for pears, most of all making low, contented, rumbling noises as it chewed through thin slices with startling enthusiasm. What scared me was how fast it was growing. The change was constant and impossible to ignore. In just a few weeks, it was noticeably larger. By the end of the first month, it had doubled its weight, pushing close to 30 pounds, and stood almost 3 feet tall when it straightened up. When my wife finally came home, there was no avoiding the truth anymore. She found me in the basement one afternoon with this rapidly growing creature clambering over my shoulders, tugging gently at my hair and making pleased little sounds. Her reaction was instant and explosive. She screamed. The infant immediately scrambled down my body and darted behind my legs, peeking out at her with huge, terrified eyes. She backed away in shock, demanding to know what that thing was and why it was inside our house. Her mind went straight to the worst conclusions. Illegal wildlife, some protected species I'd abducted, crimes I hadn't even considered. She was furious that I'd brought something potentially dangerous into our home without telling her. The argument lasted hours. Voices were raised. Accusations flew. Through it all, the infant watched us intently, making anxious sounds whenever our voices grew sharp, clearly reacting to the tension. What finally changed everything wasn't anything I said. It was the infant. When it realized my wife was afraid, it slowly climbed down from my shoulders and approached her on its own. It moved carefully, hesitantly, like it understood fear and wanted to ease it. It held out one small hand, palm open, in a gesture so gentle it looked deliberate. She recoiled at first, but the infant sat down instead of advancing and let out a soft, almost pleading sound. Quiet, harmless, heartbreakingly vulnerable. Something in her shifted. When she finally allowed it to touch her hand, it wrapped its fingers around hers with a careful squeeze and looked up at her. I watched the fear drain from her face, replaced by disbelief, then awe. She lifted it cautiously, expecting resistance, maybe even aggression. Instead, it pressed itself against her chest and made soft, happy sounds, grabbing gentle fistfuls of her shirt like a child seeking comfort. From that moment on, everything changed. We spent the next week researching quietly, obsessively. Late nights, whispered conversations, computers dimmed. There were stories, plenty of them. Blurry photos, people claiming sightings, forums filled with speculation and arguments, but nothing useful. Nothing about care, nothing about feeding, no advice, no experts, no instructions for raising something that officially didn't exist. We talked through every option again and again. Wildlife agencies were out of the question. We both knew what would happen. Testing, containment, maybe worse. Zoos weren't any better. It would become an exhibit, studied and confined for the rest of its life. Neither of us could accept that. So we made a decision that would define the rest of our lives. We would raise it, but not as a pet. Our goal was simple and terrifying: prepare it to survive on its own and return it to the wild when the time came. It deserved freedom, a real life, not captivity disguised as protection. That choice changed everything. It meant planning years ahead, teaching survival, not obedience, encouraging instincts, not dependency, accepting that we were caretakers, not owners, even as we grew deeply attached to the strange, wonderful little being sharing our home. Our first major task was converting the detached workshop into a living space. The basement had worked when it was small, but its growth was relentless. By the time it reached 3 months old, it was roughly the size of a 5-year-old child, and far stronger than any adult man I'd ever known. Once, I watched it lift our coffee table with one hand, casually hoisting it aside to retrieve a toy that had rolled underneath. Another time, it punched straight through drywall during play, leaving a jagged hole I had to repair in a hurry. The workshop gave it room to move and gave us peace of mind. We insulated it, added heat, reinforced flooring, and spent more money than I care to admit. It became a self-contained space, functional and comfortable, designed for something growing far faster than any child ever could. At night, we started taking it into the backyard, teaching it about the trees lining our property. Teaching, though, might be the wrong word. The instinct was already there. The first time I pointed to a tall spruce, it climbed 30 feet in seconds, moving with smooth, effortless precision. Watching it felt like witnessing something ancient and perfectly designed, and I knew then we weren't raising it, we were preparing it. The way it moved was flawless, every reach deliberate, every step placed with absolute certainty. There was no trial and error, no slipping or second guessing. It flowed through the trees like it had been born knowing exactly where to put its hands and feet. Some nights, it would stay aloft for hours, vaulting from branch to branch with jumps that defied logic, assembling crude-looking nests from snapped limbs and leaves that turned out to be surprisingly well-engineered once you looked closely. We had to be meticulous about when we let it outside. Porch lights had to be dark, curtains drawn, no neighbors wandering around. Watching something that large sail through treetops behind our house felt unreal, like witnessing footage from a nature special that had somehow leaked into real life. What stunned us most, though, was its mind. It learned how doors worked simply by watching us. One day it stood quietly, observing me twist a handle. The next day it tried it itself and succeeded. Within a week, every door in the house was fair game. Latches, sliding bolts, even the child-proof cabinet locks we installed were no match. It studied mechanics the way other animals studied food. It also understood intent. If I pointed at an object and said its name, it would go to it. If I gestured toward something I wanted, moved, it would do it. Communication didn't require language. It grasped meaning through motion and tone alone. Even more unsettling was what it already knew. It never sampled the wrong plants in our yard, never tested something dangerous. It avoided toxic greenery instinctively, as if the knowledge had been etched into it long before it was born. And when the neighboring dogs barked at night, drawn by its scent, it reacted instantly, retreating and hiding with a fear so raw it couldn't be learned in a few months. That reaction felt ancient, inherited, like its kind and canines had been enemies for generations. Those early months were full of near disasters. Once, my cousin dropped by without warning while I was in the workshop with it. We barely had time to scramble it up into the storage loft before I rushed to answer the door, heart racing, inventing excuses for why he couldn't come inside. It stayed utterly silent above us the entire time, as if it understood exactly what was at stake. I remember him studying my face, asking if I was okay, saying I looked exhausted. I laughed it off while my pulse hammered in my ears. Another time, a delivery driver walked around back to drop off a package and caught a glimpse of something huge and furred shifting behind the workshop window. We joked that it was a costume project, laughed too loudly, but he kept glancing over his shoulder as he left. I'm sure he assumed we were hiding something illegal. When it was around 4 months old, we began taking it into the forest before dawn. We'd leave the house around 4 in the morning, while the world was still asleep, and return after sunrise. If we ran into anyone, we carried it in an oversized hiking pack, praying no one looked too closely. The woods changed it. Out there, it became something else entirely. It moved without sound, gliding through brush and trees in a way I never could, no matter how many years I'd spent hiking. It would sprint ahead, disappear, then reappear minutes later from another direction, covering triple the ground we did without slowing. Its stamina was unreal. During those hikes, we saw abilities that bordered on unbelievable. It could scent deer from what had to be nearly a mile away, its posture snapping rigid, nostrils flaring, body angling toward the source like a compass needle. At the faintest noise, it would freeze completely, melting into the background so perfectly that I'd lose it even when it was only 20 feet away. More than once, I stared straight at the spot I knew it was standing and still couldn't see it until it moved. It foraged without hesitation, digging in precise locations to uncover roots and insects I didn't even know existed. It sampled plants with total confidence, never once choosing wrong. Watching it was like witnessing a manual written into muscle and bone. By the time it reached its first birthday, it was no longer a baby by any stretch of the imagination. It stood a little over 5.5 feet tall and had to weigh close to 200 pounds. Solid, dense muscle. Stronger than anyone I'd ever known, and still growing. And that's when I realized something sobering. We were running out of time. By then, its strength had become impossible to ignore. One afternoon, it casually lifted our riding mower with a single arm and shifted it aside because it was blocking the workshop door. Another time, it pulled too hard on the garage door and tore the entire thing straight off its hinges like it was nothing more than cardboard. None of it was intentional. It simply didn't understand its own power yet. Its hunger grew just as fast. We were burning through nearly 50 pounds of fruits and vegetables every week. I supplemented whenever I could with deer and rabbits I picked up along rural highways, storing them in a chest freezer out back. Our grocery bills skyrocketed. We started making jokes about hosting big family dinners just to explain why we were buying crates of produce. The cashiers began recognizing us, teasing that we must be obsessed with fruit. The neighbors noticed too. There was a smell, no way around it, a deep, earthy musk that clung to the workshop, no matter how much we aired it out. One neighbor claimed she'd seen a massive, hairy figure standing upright near the tree line late one night, too tall, too broad to be any person she'd ever seen. We panicked. Our cover story became my wife's nephew, a child with a rare medical condition that caused excessive growth and abnormal hair. It was a horrible lie, one that made my stomach churn every time I repeated it. But we were desperate. We even fabricated a photo, editing an image we found online to make it look vaguely believable. I hated deceiving people we'd lived next to for years. Then came the incident with the cat. That was the closest we ever came to losing everything. Somehow, still don't know how, it got out of the workshop during the day while we were both at work. We suspect it had learned how to manipulate simple locks just by observing us. By the time we got home, it had chased the neighbor's cat up a tree and was standing below it, making curious, rumbling sounds and reaching upward. The neighbor was in her yard screaming, phone in hand, already dialing emergency services. She was convinced a monster was about to kill her pet. The moment it heard us shouting, it reacted, not with aggression, but precision. It climbed the tree effortlessly, reached the cat, and lifted it gently by the scruff, exactly the way a mother cat carries her kittens. It climbed back down and set the animal on the ground, unharmed. The cat bolted. The neighbor froze, staring, her phone halfway to her ear. We rushed forward, guiding it back inside before she could process what she'd seen, murmuring apologies and nonsense explanations. We told her it was our nephew having an episode, that his condition sometimes caused impulsive behavior, and that we were deeply sorry. She didn't call the police, but the look she gave us said she would never forget what she'd seen. That night, we faced reality. It was too big, too curious, too visible. We couldn't keep hiding it, not without risking its life and our own. The thought of letting it go crushed me. I loved it fiercely, like a child I'd raised with my own hands. But keeping it confined was wrong, and discovery was inevitable. One clear photo, one undeniable sighting, and everything would collapse. It would be taken, and it would not survive that. So we changed our approach. We began taking long camping trips, 2, sometimes 3 weeks at a time. We told our employers we were dealing with ongoing family emergencies. The neighbors believed we were helping relatives out of state. In truth, we were driving deep into remote wilderness, far from towns, far from maintained trails, places where old logging roads disappeared into nothing and human footprints were rare. Out there, it thrived. We focused on preparing it for independence, though it quickly became clear it needed very little instruction. It built shelters with ease, arched frameworks of bent saplings and woven leaves that shed rain and blocked wind perfectly. The structures were complex, intelligently designed, with sloped roofs and insulated walls. It learned to fish by instinct, standing motionless in icy streams until a trout swam close enough, then striking faster than my eyes could track. We showed it how to dig for roots and turn over decaying logs for insects, but most of the time it was already doing those things on its own. The knowledge was there, deep, dormant, waiting. I often wondered whether Bigfoot mothers taught their young these skills, or if they were simply born carrying generations of survival inside them. During our second year together, we embarked on a 3-week trip into one of the most isolated regions we'd ever visited. And that was when it truly became what it was meant to be. By that point, it stood just shy of 7 feet tall and had to weigh close to 400 pounds, nothing but dense muscle. Every movement carried effortless control, strength balanced by an almost elegant precision. Our first real test came one night when a black bear wandered straight into our camp, drawn by the scent of food. It was enormous, easily 500 pounds, thick-necked and bold. Without hesitation, the Bigfoot stepped in front of us. It rose to its full height and released a sound I had never heard before, a low, thunderous roar that seemed to ripple through the air itself. It wasn't just loud, it was felt. The vibration hit my chest like a physical force. Birds erupted from the trees in every direction. The bear froze. Despite outweighing the Bigfoot, it took one look at that towering, upright figure, heard that impossible sound, and bolted. It crashed through the brush in blind panic, fleeing so fast it nearly tripped over itself. That was when it truly hit me. The Bigfoot wasn't merely surviving out there, it was dominating. This wasn't a scavenger or a hidden curiosity clinging to existence. It was an apex presence, something even the most fearless animals instinctively avoided. Its vocal abilities continued to evolve. It could reproduce bird calls flawlessly, matching the pitch and timing of robins, jays, and even the layered melodies of songbirds. It mimicked elk bugles so convincingly that we heard real elk answering from miles away. Sometimes it even replicated the sound of wind moving through trees. At night, it would sit just beyond the edge of our firelight and produce long, complex sequences of sounds, patterns of whistles, hoots, and deep, humming tones that felt intentional, structured, almost linguistic. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to communicate, calling out to others like itself, waiting for a response that never came. Those sounds carried a loneliness that cut straight through me. We also discovered it had begun making tools. It sharpened sticks by grinding them against stone until they formed usable points for digging. It selected specific rocks for cracking nuts, clearly understanding which shapes worked best. It chipped flat stones into crude scrapers, shaping edges carefully until they could strip bark or process hides. It watched us use our camping gear, then recreated simplified versions, functional, efficient, unmistakably deliberate. This wasn't just intelligence, it was awareness, something living in the space between animal instinct and human reasoning. When the Bigfoot reached its third year, we decided it was time to return it to where I'd originally found it. We drove back to the mountain range near that first discovery, parking at the same remote trailhead where everything had begun. We hiked toward the cave area together. The Bigfoot moved through the terrain as if it had never left, navigating slopes and ridges with confidence that would have killed an inexperienced human. It paused occasionally, touching trees, studying rock formations, showing what looked disturbingly like recognition. That trip terrified me. We encountered hunters. I heard their voices drifting through the forest before I saw them, and my heart nearly stopped. The Bigfoot reacted instantly, freezing, then dissolving into the woods so completely that even though I was staring right at it, I lost track of where it had gone. 2 hunters passed within 10 feet of its hiding spot, rifles slung over their shoulders, chatting casually. They joked about Bigfoot sightings in the area, laughing at people who believed in fairy tales, while the real thing stood motionless less than 20 feet away. One of them paused right where I thought it was concealed. I was certain he'd see it. He didn't. The second encounter was different. One hunter caught a glimpse, a shadow between trees, a shape that didn't belong, and raised his rifle. The Bigfoot moved faster than I thought anything that large could move. In seconds, it closed the distance and struck the weapon aside so hard it flew 30 feet and slammed into a tree. The hunter fell backward, scrambling away on hands and knees in pure panic. Then the Bigfoot vanished. One second it was there, then nothing. Gone into the forest at a speed my eyes couldn't track. Later, I overheard that hunter describing an 8-foot monster with glowing eyes to his companion, his voice shaking. They reported the encounter once they reached town. I read the official account online days later. That sighting made the news. Local stations ran segments about renewed Bigfoot activity in the mountains, interviewing a hunter who looked genuinely shaken by what he claimed to have seen. And I knew exactly what he had seen. After the report went public, analysts were brought onto local news programs to dissect the hunter's account. They displayed maps layered with past sightings, rolled out diagrams of hypothetical habitats, and debated migration patterns like it was a missing species instead of a rumor. For us, it meant lockdown. For nearly 2 months, we kept the Bigfoot hidden on our property while the surrounding forest filled with thrill seekers, amateur cryptozoologists, and weekend explorers armed with trail cams and telephoto lenses, all hoping to be the one who caught proof. The confinement took a toll. After tasting true freedom, the Bigfoot became restless and irritable. It paced endlessly, circling the outbuilding for hours, letting out low, irritated vocalizations that made my skin crawl. The years that followed settled into a grim routine. Hide it when attention surged, move it deep into remote backcountry when things quieted down, and slowly, carefully, train it to avoid humans at all costs. Our biggest focus became sound. We worked relentlessly on teaching it to identify human noises from extreme distances and to treat every one of them as a warning. It learned frighteningly fast. Before long, it could detect voices I couldn't hear at all, its head snapping towards sounds carried on the wind from what had to be miles away. We practiced near hiking corridors. The Bigfoot would shadow groups from afar, paralleling them through dense forest while remaining completely unseen. Its patience was unreal. It could hold a single position for hours, barely breathing, muscles locked in a way that would have been unbearable for any human. It also learned technology. It began recognizing the faint mechanical click trail cameras made when activating. Sometimes it avoided them entirely. Other times, disturbingly, it would remove them. We'd later find piles of shattered plastic and glass, cameras crushed so thoroughly they were unrecognizable. When the Bigfoot was around 6 years old, we had another near disaster. A state wildlife officer came onto our land following reports of illegal deer harvesting nearby. While inspecting the area, he discovered massive, unusual footprints near the tree line. He photographed them with measurement scales, made plaster casts, and collected hair snagged from our fence where the Bigfoot had rubbed against it. A month later, an official letter arrived. It stated that DNA testing had returned results consistent with an unknown primate. An investigation had been opened into the potential possession of an unregistered exotic animal. The letter outlined fines, legal consequences, and even possible jail time. We panicked. Within days, we relocated the Bigfoot to a forest over 100 miles away, setting up a temporary camp while we dealt with authorities. We played dumb, told them we'd seen the same tracks, that something wild was raiding our property, and asked for advice like confused, worried homeowners. Eventually, the investigation stalled. Without an animal, there was nothing they could prove. Still, the stress nearly broke me. I barely slept. Every knock at the door made my stomach drop. I developed an ulcer and lost weight without trying. It felt like living under a microscope. The Bigfoot didn't handle the separation well. Even though we visited weekly with supplies, it was clearly distressed. We arrived one day to find its shelter destroyed. Branches snapped, leaves scattered, the entire structure torn apart in frustration. On our third week, we discovered it had traveled more than 30 miles trying to return to us, crossing terrain that shouldn't have been navigable in darkness. We tracked it through rugged country by its distinctive prints and markings. That determination, its intelligence, was both awe-inspiring and devastating. It wanted to come home, but we couldn't risk it. Once the investigation officially closed and monitoring equipment disappeared from our original land, we were finally able to bring it back. That close call forced a realization we'd been avoiding. We couldn't keep it forever. By then, the Bigfoot was nearing 8 feet tall and weighed well over 600 pounds. Too large, too aware, too capable to remain hidden indefinitely. We had to prepare for permanent release. The idea shattered me. We'd spent nearly 7 years raising this being, watching it grow from a helpless infant into something powerful and independent. Letting go felt unbearable. We purchased a large, isolated parcel of land in an extremely remote region and constructed what appeared to be a simple hunting cabin. In reality, it was a reinforced enclosure designed specifically for the Bigfoot. The only access was a logging road that washed out half the year. The surrounding wilderness stretched for millions of acres in every direction. It was there we began noticing the signs of maturity. The Bigfoot started marking territory, rubbing trees until bark peeled away, snapping branches into deliberate patterns that looked less like destruction and more like communication, messages we weren't meant to read. As time went on, its behavior shifted in ways we'd been expecting, but still weren't prepared for emotionally. It became more self-directed, more territorial, especially when food was involved. If we lingered too close while it ate, it would let out a low warning growl, unmistakably telling us to give it space. One afternoon, I made the mistake of stepping in while it was feeding, trying to add more food to the pile. It spun toward me, lips pulled back, teeth fully visible, and shoved me away with a force that sent me sprawling. There was no doubt it could have seriously hurt me if it wanted to, but it didn't. The restraint was deliberate. That moment wasn't about aggression. It was about adulthood. It was setting boundaries, claiming autonomy, becoming something separate from us. And as painful as it was to feel that distance forming, this was exactly what we'd been working toward all along. The creature that once followed us everywhere, that curled against us for comfort, was slipping fully into the wild. By the time it reached roughly 10 years of age, we began actively planning for the end. We extended our wilderness trips, pushing farther into isolated areas and staying longer each time. We'd establish a base camp, then step back, allowing it to roam freely, sometimes disappearing for days without a trace. On one trip, we watched from a ridge as it made its first successful solo hunt. It waited beside a game trail for hours, completely still, breath so shallow it barely moved its chest. When a doe wandered close enough, it exploded into motion, closing the gap in seconds. The kill was swift and precise, a single, decisive movement. What followed was even more striking. It knew exactly how to process the animal, opening the body efficiently and consuming the most vital organs first without hesitation. Watching that moment broke me in conflicting ways. There was pride, real, overwhelming pride in seeing it succeed on its own, and there was grief, because I knew what that success meant. Our role was ending. After that hunt, something changed in it. It carried itself differently, more assured, more dominant, like it had crossed an invisible threshold. Territorial behavior escalated. It stripped bark from trees in wide swaths, snapped branches high overhead, and left markings at regular intervals along trails, as if drawing invisible borders. Once, driven by curiosity, I tried to interfere. It shoved me aside without warning, hard enough that I fell backward and cracked my head against a rock. My vision flashed white, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. The message was unmistakable. I was no longer in charge. From then on, we began deliberately reducing our presence. Visits that were once daily became weekly, then bi-weekly. Each time it ranged farther, stayed away longer. Evidence of its life spread across the forest. Remains of carefully processed deer, fish bones near streams, and increasingly complex shelters scattered across miles of terrain. Every structure showed refinement. Angled roofs, windbreaks, smart placement. When it reached 12 years old, we identified a place that felt right for final release. A vast, untouched stretch of wilderness deep in the northern mountains, more than 50 miles from the nearest town, and rarely visited by anyone. The environment was perfect. Dense old-growth forest, abundant water, healthy populations of deer and elk, and countless natural shelters hidden among rock formations and caves. We established a base camp on a ridge overlooking a wide, untouched valley, and began bringing it there for extended stays. At first, we checked in frequently, worried it might struggle, but it didn't. It barely noticed. Soon, when we arrived, it would already be gone. Outranging across the valley, we realized it had claimed as its own. We'd track it using the signs it left behind. Snapped branches, distinctive footprints along riverbanks, territorial scars on trees. When we finally did find it, it often seemed surprised by us, sometimes even irritated, like we were disrupting its routine rather than belonging in it. That's when I built the observation blind. High on a ridge, hidden with bark and brush, invisible from below. From there, using a spotting scope, I could watch it live its life from a distance, half a mile away, without interfering, without being seen. I spent most of that first year after the release camped on the ridge, unable to fully walk away. Day after day, I watched through the scope, telling myself I was just making sure it was okay. But really, I wasn't ready to let go. It didn't need my concern. The creature had taken control of the valley completely. Its range stretched for miles in every direction, easily 20 square miles, maybe more, and nothing contested it. Deer altered their trails. Coyotes avoided certain ridges altogether. Even the local bears kept their distance, circling wide around the heart of its territory as if they understood the hierarchy instinctively. We had one final scare during that period. A group of backpackers wandered into the valley, drawn by the untouched landscape and clear streams. 5 of them, well-equipped, expensive packs, cameras hanging from their necks. I watched nervously as they pitched tents right in the center of the area the Bigfoot had claimed. From the tree line, it observed them. It did exactly what we'd taught it to do. It stayed hidden. It moved only when they were distracted or asleep. One night, I saw it drift into the edge of their camp, silent as fog, standing just beyond the glow of their dying campfire. It didn't touch anything. It didn't threaten them. It simply watched, curious, alert, controlled. 2 days later, the hikers packed up and left. One of them laughed about how lucky they were to have seen so much wildlife. None of them ever realized what had been watching their tents rise and fall with their breathing every night. When the Bigfoot reached around 15 years of age, the valley changed. I began finding tracks that weren't its. These prints were larger, heavier, with a different stride and weight distribution, something older, stronger. I noticed new markings on trees as well, branches twisted and broken in patterns I didn't recognize, territorial signals that didn't match the ones my Bigfoot had always used. Then it started leaving, at first for a few days, then weeks at a time. I'd sit in my blind staring at an empty valley, my chest tight with worry. Eventually, trail cameras caught glimpses of another figure, blurry, massive, moving with a smoother, more fluid gait, possibly female, though I couldn't be sure. When my Bigfoot returned from those absences, it was injured. Deep claw marks across its shoulders, bite wounds on its arms. Clear evidence of violent encounters. Every instinct in me screamed to intervene, to clean wounds, to help, to protect. But I didn't. I stayed hidden. This was the wild asserting itself. Territory disputes, mating competition, a life I had no right to interfere with anymore. What amazed me was how fast it healed. Wounds that would hospitalize a human for months faded in days. I watched through the scope as it treated itself, deliberately selecting leaves and mixing them with water and mud into thick pastes. It pressed into injuries. It knew exactly what it was doing. That level of knowledge, of medicine, of care, was staggering. When it was 17, the cameras captured something I'd barely dared to hope for. Footage of my Bigfoot moving alongside another one. They weren't fighting. They walked together, occasionally brushing hands or shoulders, sharing space in a way that felt unmistakably intimate. I saw them together in person, too, moving in harmony, communicating with subtle sounds and gestures I couldn't decode. They shared food, groomed one another, built shelters together. It was everything I'd wanted for it. It wasn't alone anymore. That was when I finally understood my role was over. I began visiting less, sometimes only hiking to the ridge and watching from afar. Months would pass without a sighting, and I'd wonder if it had moved on, or worse. But the signs were always there, fresh tracks, new markings, evidence of shelter and hunts. It was still there, still thriving, and for the first time, that knowledge brought me peace instead of fear. Fresh signs were everywhere once I knew how to read them. Huge footprints pressed into damp soil near creeks. Newly scarred trees marked high up the trunks, feeding sites where bones and hides were left in deliberate places. The valley no longer belonged to a single creature. It was becoming something else, a community. One evening, just as I was preparing to pack up and accept that I might never see it again, movement caught my eye at the edge of the forest. I raised the scope, and my breath caught in my throat. It stepped out of the trees, not alone. Beside it was a second, slightly smaller figure, and in that figure's arms was something tiny. I felt my knees weaken as the truth settled in. A baby, no more than 2 feet tall, covered in dark, nearly black fur that absorbed the fading light. The little one splashed into the shallow stream, squealing with delight, tumbling in the water like it had no fear of the world at all. The sound carried faintly across the valley, high, playful, unmistakably joyful. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, my hands shaking so badly I had to brace the scope against the blind. I watched the Bigfoot I had raised kneel near the water, showing the infant how to fish. The baby lunged clumsily, missed, fell face first into the stream, flailing in a way that would have been hilarious if it hadn't shattered me emotionally. I'd seen that exact movement years ago. The same awkward enthusiasm, the same stubborn determination. The adults waited patiently, guiding with gentle touches and low sounds. Then the larger Bigfoot demonstrated, standing motionless before striking with impossible speed, pulling a fish from the water in a blur of motion. The babies stared, transfixed. This was how it was passed on, not written, not spoken, shown. Then, without warning, the Bigfoot I had raised turned its head. It looked straight at me, half a mile away, hidden, perfectly concealed. And yet those eyes, so familiar, so impossibly aware, locked onto mine. The same eyes I'd seen in a cave nearly 2 decades earlier, dark, reflective, alive with recognition. It had always known. Those eyes held something I can't fully describe. Awareness, memory, and yes, gratitude. It released a long, low sound that rolled across the valley. Not aggressive, not fearful. Something closer to acknowledgement or goodbye. The sound hit me in the chest like a physical force. My vision blurred as tears spilled freely. I raised my hand and waved. The same small gesture I'd used thousands of times when it was young. After a moment, it lifted one massive arm and returned the gesture. Carefully, intentionally, a motion I had taught it long ago when it was small enough to cling to my jacket. We stayed like that for several seconds, 2 lives separated by distance and destiny, bound by something unbreakable. Then it turned back to the infant and the other adult, and the 3 of them slipped into the forest, dissolving into shadow until nothing remained. That night, I dismantled the blind with trembling hands. I walked back to my truck in darkness, stumbling more than once, not caring. I knew that was the last time I would ever see it, and that was exactly how it needed to be. The creature I'd found freezing and alone had survived. It had grown strong. It had found its own kind, and now it was raising young. I had given it freedom. 3 years have passed since then. I still visit those mountains sometimes, hiking nearby trails when life allows. But I never enter the valley anymore. I won't risk interfering with what's growing there. Occasionally, I see signs that might belong to it, tracks with familiar pressure patterns, markings at just the right height. But I never try to confirm. There could be many of them now. I see reports online sometimes. Grainy footage, excited voices, amateur investigators arguing in comment sections, and I smile, knowing that at least some of what they're seeing is real. Some of those shadows exist because we chose compassion over fear. My wife and I keep detailed journals locked away in a safety deposit box several towns over, hundreds of pages, a few photographs, a complete record of everything. We never talk about it. We never will, because belief doesn't matter. And because the moment the world truly knows, it would destroy what it never meant to harm. If the truth ever surfaced, it wouldn't end kindly. They would follow footprints with measuring tapes and drones. They would catalog, classify, restrain. Tags would be attached, collars fitted, blood drawn. Every mystery reduced to data. Everything I spent decades protecting would be undone in a matter of weeks. The freedom I fought so hard to secure would be stripped away. There are nights when I still question myself. I wonder if I had the right to interfere at all, if I should have left that tiny life in the stone hollow and trusted the wilderness to make its own choice. Maybe the mother would have returned. Maybe I disrupted a balance that had existed long before I ever set foot in those mountains. But then I remember standing on that ridge years later, watching it wade through cold water with an infant of its own. I remember the moment it looked up and locked eyes with me across the distance. The recognition was unmistakable, and in that instant I knew, without doubt, that I had given it something it never would have had otherwise. Without my choice, it would have frozen alone before the sun ever rose. 2 decades of my life went into protecting a species most people dismiss as folklore or a bad joke or a guy in a costume. I've never told this story before, and I probably shouldn't be telling you now, but I'm not young anymore. I'm in my early 50s, my hair thinning, and my joints reminding me every morning that time doesn't slow down for anyone. I needed someone to know the truth, to understand that they exist, that they are real, and that they deserve solitude, not cages. If you ever hear reports about strange sightings in the northern mountain ranges, shadows caught on trail cameras, massive shapes crossing ridge lines, just remember there may be more truth in those stories than people are willing to admit. I take comfort in knowing that somewhere out there that creature is still alive, teaching its young how to find food, how to move silently, how to stay hidden from a world that would destroy them without ever intending to. That tiny being that reached toward me with trembling hands in the darkness all those years ago is now part of something larger, a family, maybe even a small community that has survived unseen for longer than we can imagine. Perhaps they've lived in those mountains for centuries, slipping through the spaces humans overlook, raising their young beyond the reach of our curiosity. On quiet nights, when the air is still, I sometimes imagine I hear distant calls rolling across faraway peaks, low, echoing sounds that could be communication or memory or story, sounds that might be language passed from one generation to the next, the way people once shared tales around fires. I'll never know if one of those calls belongs to the creature I raised, but I like to believe it does. I like to believe it remembers me, remembers the human who found it, protected it, and loved it enough to walk away. I hope it teaches its young that not every human is a threat. That once, long ago, one of us chose compassion over fear. Every evening, the sun sinks behind those mountains, washing them in amber and violet and deep blue. Somewhere out there, far from roads and cities, a family settles in for the night. Maybe weaving shelter from branches, maybe sharing the day's food, maybe teaching their children how to survive in a world that refuses to believe they exist. And I'm at peace with that. More than at peace, I'm grateful. No one will ever know this story but me, my wife, and now you. That's how it has to be. Believe me or don't. Call me delusional if you want. But when the wind carries strange sounds down from the high ridges on a still night, I know what they are, and that knowledge is enough.